Okay, the purpose of this tutorial is to walk you through a couple of practice problems for Chapter 18, Population Genetics. There are fundamentally two types of problems that you'll see on the exam in the multiple choice section, and so I'm going to go through an example of each one of these. In addition, the worksheet has another practice problem for each one of these types, and I will post the answer key so that you can see if you did it correctly. The first type of question gives you some information and tells you that a population is at equilibrium and asks you to solve for a certain variable. And for that kind of question, you can apply the Hardy-Weinberg equation. The second type of problem asks for some information but tells you that the population is not in equilibrium, and so you cannot use the Hardy-Weinberg equation. So fundamentally two different ways to solve problems that are otherwise similar. Question number one is the first type of problem. It says if the recessive trait albinism is present in 1 in 10,000 individuals in a population at equilibrium, comma, calculate the frequency of the recessive mutant allele, the normal dominant allele, and heterozygotes in the population. So in this problem, you know that the population is at equilibrium, so you can apply the Hardy-Weinberg rule. You can use the Hardy-Weinberg variables or terms in order to solve this. And so I'm going to go through this problem first. The way I would start off is just a very typical concept in math. In the word problem, there is a given. And usually this is the hardest part for students, is to figure out what's given. The given portion is the first clause up until the comma. So it says if the recessive trait albinism is present in 1 out of 10,000 individuals in a population at equilibrium, stop. You want to figure out what is being told to you there in Hardy-Weinberg or math language. First of all, the recessive trait albinism is present in 1 in 10,000 individuals. A trait is not an allele. A trait is a phenotype. So trait equals phenotype. Okay? A trait is something you can see, something observable. So if the phenotype of albinism, which is a recessive type trait or carried on a recessive allele, if a recessive trait is found in 1 in 10,000 individuals, then what they're really telling you is that the frequency of homozygous recessive individuals for that recessive allele for albinism is 1 in 10,000. And you'll remember that in Hardy-Weinberg language, the frequency of homozygous recessive genotypes is given the term Q squared. Okay, so what they've given you is Q squared equals 1 in 10,000. Okay, that's given. Now, and because they tell you it's a population at equilibrium, you're allowed to use the Hardy-Weinberg terms. Now, the second part of the question is what do you need to figure out? Or what you could say, I need to know. What do you need to know? They're asking you for, in part A, they're asking you for the frequency of the recessive allele. The frequency of the recessive allele is equal to Q in Hardy-Weinberg language. That's the definition of Q. In B, they're asking you for the frequency of the dominant allele. So the frequency of the dominant allele in Hardy-Weinberg language is P. So those are what you're trying to find. And in part C, they're asking you to figure out the frequency of heterozygotes. The frequency of heterozygotes is the frequency of individuals with a heterozygous genotype. And in Hardy-Weinberg language, that's 2 times P times Q. Okay? So that's what you're trying to figure out. So you're going to start with the given. Now, if Q squared equals 1 in 10,000, the only thing you can use that for is to solve for Q. So you take the square root of both sides, and you get Q equals, I don't want that, Q equals the square root of 1 in 10,000, which is 1 in 100, which in decimals is 0.01. And that's actually the first thing you're supposed to find is Q, so Q is 0.01. 1% of the alleles in the gene pool are recessive alleles. If 1% of the alleles are recessive, then 99% have to be the dominant. We're assuming a very simple case in chapter 18 that there's only 2 alleles. This equation can be expanded for more than 2 alleles, but we're taking a very simple approach to start with. So if you have 2 alleles and one is recessive and one is dominant, and 1% of the alleles are recessive, then 99% of the alleles have to be dominant. And then the third part is the frequency of heterozygotes. It's defined as 2pq, so we just take 2 times the value that we got for p times the value that we got for q. We just plug that in and we get 0.0198, or a little bit less than 2% is the frequency of heterozygotes in our population. So we have 1 in 10,000 individuals are homozygous recessive, and about 2 in 100, almost 2 in 100, are heterozygous. So that's one way. That's a very typical problem that you might be given, is that you're given q squared, you're given a number for that, and then you're asked to solve for the other parts, the other terms. The other type of question you might get is shown here, number 2. It says in a population of 100 people, 75 are homozygous dominant, 20 are heterozygous, and 5 are homozygous recessive. Those are genotypes. What's the frequency of the dominant allele in the gene pool? Do not assume equilibrium. To solve this one, you're going to apply the technique that I explained in the lecture, which is you take all the dominant individuals plus half of the heterozygotes, all the homozygous dominant individuals, and add half of the heterozygotes divided by the total. I don't know how I'm going to do that. Divided by 100. Pretend like there's a line there. Oh, I can make a line there. That would be the frequency of the dominant allele. The frequency of the recessive allele, although they didn't ask for it, but they could have, the frequency of the recessive allele would be the number of homozygous recessive individuals plus half the heterozygotes divided by the total. Okay? And oops. Okay, so this one works out to be 75 plus half of 20 is 85 out of 100. Is 0.85 or 85%. 5 plus half of 20 is 10. So 5 plus 10 is 15 divided by 100 is 0.15. So the frequency of the big A allele is 85%. The frequency of the little a allele is 15%. They add up to 100%, or 1 in the decimal form. And so that works out. So when you do not assume equilibrium, then you do this type of calculation. You see how this does not involve a Hardy-Weinberg law. So this works for any kind of population. So those are the 2 fundamental types of problems. I have listed here for you another version of a Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium problem and another version of a non-equilibrium problem. And I will post the answer keys for those on eCampus, and you can do it. What I would suggest is try to do it on your own before you look at the answer key. If you can do it and you get the right answer, then you're good. If you just look at the answer key, then you won't really know if you could come up with the answer on your own. So that's really the true test of whether you understand it, is if you can do it without looking at the answer ahead of time. And these we'll do some of this in lab on Friday, on our lab for population genetics and Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So you'll benefit from having done these.